Everyone thinks the Great Depression ended because of New Deals, stimulus, and hope. But that's not what really saved the world economy. The truth is far less romantic and far more coordinated. It wasn't the will of the people that stabilized currencies in the 1930s. It was an agreement between three financial empires, the United States, Britain, and France, to quietly decide what money would be worth. The Tripartite Agreement of 1936 sounds dull, even bureaucratic, just another diplomatic communiqué signed in the fog of recovery. But behind those few pages lay the foundation of the modern monetary world, a world where gold no longer ruled, yet the illusion of stability was stronger than ever. You could say it was the first global currency algorithm, long before computers existed. Officially, it was about cooperation. Unofficially, it was about survival. By 1936, the global economy was a battlefield of devaluations, each nation cutting the value of its own currency to steal exports and jobs from the others. Britain had left the gold standard in 1931, the US in 1933, and France, clinging desperately to sound money, watched its gold reserves drain away as capital fled. The result was chaos. Exchange rates swung wildly. Trade collapsed, and trust, the oxygen of finance, evaporated. The newspaper said the Tripartite Agreement restored confidence. What they didn't say was that it also created a new hierarchy of power. The US dollar, British pound, and French franc would now move in harmony. But that harmony was directed by Washington and London, not Paris. France joined late and reluctantly, and in doing so, surrendered its last vestige of monetary independence. The Pact wasn't a handshake among equals. It was a soft takeover, a velvet coup of currencies. And here's the paradox. This stabilization of 1936 wasn't really stability at all. It was a truce, the moment nations agreed not to fight openly over gold, while secretly preparing the rules of a world where gold itself would lose meaning. From that day on, money became a managed illusion, guided by agreements instead of metal. If that sounds familiar, it should, because every central bank meeting since, from Bretton Woods to the G7 to today's Federal Reserve summits, traces its DNA back to this forgotten accord. To understand why the Tripartite Agreement mattered, we have to step back into the early 1930s, a time when the word currency meant power, and gold was still the final judge of truth. Every country claimed to respect that judge, but when the Depression hit, the first thing governments did was cheat. The gold standard, that sacred promise that every unit of money could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold, had already started to crack after World War I. Britain had returned to it in 1925 at the pre-war rate of £4.86 to the dollar, an act of pride rather than prudence. It made British exports uncompetitive, drained gold from the Bank of England, and forced endless borrowing from New York. France, meanwhile, had devalued early and rebuilt its reserves, becoming the vault of Europe. By 1930, the Banque de France held almost a quarter of the world's monetary gold. Then came the Great Depression, the mathematical revenge of overproduction, debt, and deflation. Prices collapsed, unemployment soared, and governments clung to gold like a drowning man to an anchor. Britain broke first. In September 1931, under pressure from a run on sterling, the pound was floated. The world was shocked. "The pound has fallen," newspapers screamed. But the British economy quietly began to heal. A cheaper currency made exports affordable again. America watched and learned. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt took the United States off the gold standard, confiscated private gold, and devalued the dollar from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. Overnight, the U.S. created billions in new paper wealth and made its debt easier to bear. France refused to follow. It clung to its strong franc policy, the last pillar of what was called the gold bloc, along with Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. By 1936, that stubbornness became suicide. Speculators attacked the franc, gold fled Paris, and French industry was collapsing under the weight of an overvalued currency. The newly elected Popular Front government, led by Léon Blum, faced a choice: defend gold or defend jobs. And in the language of survival, jobs win. That's when the backroom diplomacy began. The United States, Britain, and France needed a truce, not out of friendship, but because each was exhausted. Britain's empire depended on stable trade. America wanted to sell its recovery. France wanted to stop the bleeding. So in September 1936, representatives from the three powers met in London and agreed to what they called a stabilization of exchange rates. The text was simple, only a few paragraphs, but its implications were revolutionary. Each country would avoid competitive devaluation, unquote. They would consult before changing their exchange policies. And they would cooperate through their central banks, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, and the Banque de France, to maintain order in the currency markets. In plain terms, this meant the age of free-floating gold was over, the age of managed money had begun. Behind the diplomatic smiles were precise mechanics. Central banks used stabilization funds, secret pools of currency reserves, to buy or sell each other's money in the foreign exchange markets. If the pound fell too far, the U.S. would buy it. If the franc weakened, the Bank of England would step in. These funds were precursors to what we now call currency swaps, or market interventions. They were designed not to restore gold convertibility, but to preserve the illusion of stability while each country quietly printed and spent to revive its economy. This was the birth of what historians later called monetary diplomacy. For the first time, nations realized they didn't need gold to anchor their systems, only each other's promises. Trust replaced metal. But trust, as history teaches, is always political. The hidden winners were not the taxpayers or workers. It was the creditors, the central banks, the financial houses of London and New York, that suddenly gained a new kind of power, the power to set value by agreement, not by geology. When you can define the price of money itself, you don't need to own the gold mines. You are the mine. From that moment, the world's monetary order began to shift from substance to consensus. It was no longer about how much gold you held, but about how well you could coordinate narratives, how convincingly you could say, our money is strong. The Tripartite Agreement didn't end the Depression, but it built the scaffolding for the post-war world, the prototype of Bretton Woods, the IMF, and every coordinated rescue operation that followed. It was, in essence, the first global central bankers' pact. If you've ever wondered why nations today move in unison, raising rates, cutting rates, printing in harmony, it began here, in 1936, in quiet rooms filled with smoke, fear, and the scent of gold slipping away. If this kind of hidden architecture of money fascinates you, share this with someone who still thinks markets move freely. They never did. For a few short years, it looked like the system worked. Newspapers in London and New York spoke of restored stability. The pound stopped falling, the franc stopped bleeding, and the dollar seemed untouchable. Politicians congratulated themselves. Economists published papers with elegant titles: Cooperative Stabilization and the Return of Confidence. But confidence is the most dangerous illusion of all. It feeds on itself until it consumes reality. From 1936 to 1939, the Tripartite Agreement appeared to give the world something like peace. Not peace between nations, but peace between currencies. Exchange rates barely moved. Gold outflow slowed. For the first time in a decade, traders could calculate prices without fear of waking up to a new devaluation. To the ordinary citizen, that felt like recovery. Shops reopened, wages inched up, and governments boasted that international cooperation had tamed a storm. But what really happened was subtler. The agreement didn't fix the global economy, it froze it. It was like putting a cracked mirror back together with glue. The reflection returned, but the cracks remained beneath the surface. Each of the three powers pursued its own hidden agenda under the same polite umbrella. Britain quietly expanded credit through the Exchange Equalization Account, its stabilization fund, to keep sterling cheap enough for exports but not so cheap as to panic investors. The United States, flush with gold inflows from Europe, used the Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund to maintain control over the dollar's exchange rate while financing Roosevelt's domestic recovery. France, the weakest of the trio, tried to balance both worlds, fighting inflation at home while relying on the Anglo-American axis to prevent another currency collapse. In effect, the Tripartite Agreement was the first managed currency cartel. It was not built to restore a natural balance, but to manufacture one. The markets no longer decided what a pound, dollar, or franc was worth. Committees did. And yet, people believed. Investors saw the apparent calm as proof that governments had finally learned their lesson from the Great Depression. They thought cooperation meant safety. They didn't see that this cooperation was possible only because all three nations were quietly rearming. Money printing was justified as stimulus, but much of it flowed into steel, ships, and weapons. The world's first monetary peace pact was financing the next war. The illusion worked because it felt humane. It gave workers jobs and governments time. Keynes himself praised it as a step toward managed flexibility. But behind every managed system lies someone doing the managing and someone paying for it. The real beneficiaries weren't the people rebuilding their lives in Marseille or Manchester. They were the bondholders and bankers who had finally found a way to make profits in a world that no longer obeyed gold, but still feared inflation. Here's the paradox that defines every era of managed money. Stability breeds excess. Once nations stopped competing openly through devaluations, they began competing secretly through spending. If you can't change your currency's value, you change your budget. Britain expanded its defense industry. The United States issued more treasury debt. France, unable to match either, leaned on the Bank of France's reserves until the numbers no longer added up. Mathematically, the illusion couldn't last. When a nation promises to maintain an exchange rate without gold or growth to support it, it's like a bridge suspended by air. It holds until the first real wind. But in the late 1930s, the world didn't see the wind coming. It saw the calm before it. 1937 was the year of false recovery. Industrial output rose, trade revived, Wall Street cheered. Yet beneath it, the same imbalance that had destroyed the gold standard remained, now hidden under layers of diplomacy and mutual guarantees. You can say the Tripartite Agreement was the first monetary placebo. It didn't cure the disease, it just made the patient feel better long enough to forget it was still sick. And as always, illusion leads to power. When money appears stable, those who control its creation gain the confidence to expand their reach. The Bank of England became not just a national bank, but a global coordinator. The U.S. Treasury, under Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., began to realize that the world's currencies could orbit the dollar, not by decree, but by dependence. That was the quiet miracle of the 1936 Pact. It turned economic chaos into political leverage. Washington and London didn't just cooperate with Paris, they tamed it. The gold that once ruled them was now serving them. We've seen this pattern again and again. Once a monetary alliance starts producing stability, it also starts producing dominance. From Bretton Woods to the Eurozone, the logic never changes. Promise unity, then rule through coordination. The tripartite illusion taught the modern world its most dangerous lesson, that control disguised as cooperation feels like peace, until it doesn't. If this helped you see how stability can be the mask of control, hit like, or share this with someone who still believes in market self-regulation. It's time they knew who really pulls the strings. The Tripartite Agreement promised stability. What it delivered, eventually, was paralysis. When a system is built on cooperation without truth, on numbers managed instead of earned, it doesn't explode, it erodes. Slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. By 1938, the cracks began to show. France, the reluctant partner, was running out of gold again. Confidence in the franc was evaporating as political unrest mounted. The Popular Front government that had once symbolized hope now faced strikes, capital flight, and a growing fear of war. While the United States and Britain quietly rearmed under deficit spending, France tried to defend both its currency and its borders, and could do neither. The Banque de France's reserves fell from 82 billion francs worth of gold in 1932 to barely half that by 1938. Investors could read the math. They saw what governments pretended not to see. You can stabilize currencies only as long as you can afford to defend the illusion. Once the numbers diverge from reality, diplomacy becomes theater. Behind the closed doors of central banks, panic whispered again. Britain's exchange equalization account had swollen into a permanent instrument of control. No longer a temporary stabilization fund, but a lever of statecraft. The U.S. Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund, created in 1934 with the windfall from Roosevelt's gold revaluation, was now used to prop up allies and buy political loyalty through loans and interventions. Cooperation had quietly turned into hierarchy. And hierarchy breeds resentment. France suspected, correctly, that London and Washington were manipulating the Pact to their own advantage. Each time the franc weakened, they would assist by buying francs, but only at rates that favored their exporters. What began as mutual defense became a subtle form of economic occupation. Then came September 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and the illusion of peacetime stability vanished overnight. The Tripartite Agreement, that elegant framework of mutual promises, collapsed not with a vote or a treaty, but with the first artillery shell. Currencies that had been harmonized were suddenly weaponized. France mobilized, Britain declared war, and the United States, officially neutral, began the greatest industrial rearmament in history, financed by debt and dollar creation. The numbers that had once been kept in balance through cooperation were now thrown into chaos by necessity. Britain's gold reserves drained to pay for American weapons under cash and carry. France, before falling to Nazi occupation in 1940, shipped what remained of its gold to the colonies and to New York, a last act of faith in a world order that no longer existed. Mathematics broke politics. No amount of diplomacy could keep exchange rates stable when factories were producing tanks instead of goods, and when the stabilization funds were being redirected to finance war instead of trade. The entire system, the very idea that currencies could be managed through gentlemen's agreements, collapsed under the weight of reality. And yet, something remarkable happened. Out of this failure was born a new kind of control. The men who had orchestrated the Tripartite Agreement, the bankers, the economists, the Treasury officials, learned a lesson. If you can coordinate money in peace, you can coordinate it in war. The next step was global. In 1944 at Bretton Woods, those same principles were resurrected on a grander scale. Fixed exchange rates, mutual consultations, stabilization through reserves, everything the Tripartite Agreement had tested, now wrapped in the flag of international reconstruction. Only this time, the gold anchor was partial, and the United States was at the center. The dollar replaced the pound as the world's measure of value. What had collapsed in 1939 was not the idea of monetary cooperation, but the illusion that it could exist without hierarchy. The Tripartite Agreement had pretended that three powers could lead together. Bretton Woods accepted what the numbers have already proven. One power would lead, and the others would follow. That's the true legacy of the 1936 Pact. It wasn't a failure, it was a prototype, a controlled demolition of the old order to clear space for the new one. The gold standard had chained governments to arithmetic. The Tripartite Agreement replaced arithmetic with policy. Bretton Woods turned policy into empire. When people say the dollar became dominant after World War II, they miss the prelude. The dollar was already being trained for leadership in 1936, inside that quiet, forgotten currency truce. What collapsed in 1939 wasn't a mistake. It was the handover from gold to governance. From markets to management, from value to narrative. Every time a financial system collapses, it isn't because the intentions were bad. It's because the math stopped fitting the story. Numbers are merciless. They don't care about speeches or treaties. The Tripartite Agreement fell the moment trust became more expensive than truth. If you've ever wondered why every international solution seems to end in another crisis, this is why. Systems built on managed illusions must eventually meet arithmetic, and arithmetic always wins. If this resonated with you, drop a comment saying math wins, because in money, as in history, it always does. The Tripartite Agreement vanished into the smoke of war, but its blueprint never died. It simply changed its name. Bretton Woods in 1944, the Smithsonian Agreement in 1971, the Plaza Accord in 1985, the G7 summits and central bank coordination calls of today. All are descendants of that 1936 experiment. Every time the world tries to control the uncontrollable, money, it reaches for the same logic. Stabilize first, explain later. After World War II, the illusion became global policy. The United States emerged with 2/3 of the world's gold and more than half of its industrial capacity. The dollar, once one of three currencies in the tripartite balance, now stood alone. The Bretton Woods system fixed other currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold at $35 per ounce, the very same rate Roosevelt had set back in 1934. But this time, instead of three nations managing the world's exchange rates, one nation, America, managed them all. The irony is almost poetic. The Tripartite Agreement was built on equality. Bretton Woods was built on hierarchy disguised as cooperation. Nations signed the pact in the spirit of multilateralism, but the control lay in Washington's vaults, literally. The Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury dictated policy through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, institutions born from that same principle of coordination that had begun with London, Paris, and New York in 1936. For nearly 3 decades, it seemed invincible. The post-war boom, the golden age of capitalism, ran on the illusion that currencies were stable, trade was balanced, and the system was self-correcting. But again, numbers refused to behave. America printed more dollars than it had gold to back them. By 1971, when France and others began demanding redemption of their dollar reserves for bullion, President Nixon simply closed the gold window. The metal anchor was gone. The tripartite illusion had reached its logical conclusion: money by decree, value by consensus. That's where we still live today. When you see central banks coordinating interest rate moves, when the IMF issues special drawing rights, when the G20 releases joint statements about stabilizing markets, you are seeing the ghost of the Tripartite Agreement, a system built on mutual assurances and hidden hierarchies, still pretending to be a democracy of nations. Look closer at the mechanics. When markets wobble, central banks act together. The Federal Reserve opens dollar swap lines to the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England, the modern descendants of those stabilization funds from the 1930s. They buy each other's currencies, backstop liquidity, and issue statements about global financial stability. The words are new, the architecture is the same. Even crises follow the same rhythm. In 2008, during the global financial meltdown, the Fed once again became the world stabilizer. Trillions of dollars flowed across borders and secret lines of credit to keep the system afloat. It was the Tripartite Agreement, but digitized, globalized, and weaponized. Instead of three nations, dozens participated. Instead of gold, there were spreadsheets and trust. But the underlying rule hadn't changed. Money's value is not what it is, it's what a few central institutions agree it should be. And just like in 1936, cooperation hides asymmetry. Not all currencies are equal, even inside the club. The euro depends on dollar liquidity. The yen moves with U.S. Treasury yields. Emerging markets dance to the rhythm of the Fed's interest rate decisions. And every time a nation tries to break free, like the Soviet Union in the 1950s or China with the yuan today, it faces the same reality France faced in 1936. You can't fight the system while still using its money. The deeper truth is this: modern monetary policy is not economics. It's geopolitics disguised as finance. When the U.S. sanctions a country by cutting it off from dollar clearing, that's not far from the way London once used sterling dominance to control trade routes. The empire simply changed tools. Gold was too heavy. Agreements are lighter. And now, as digital currencies, BRICS alliances, and new monetary blocks rise, we are once again watching the same movie play out. Calls for a multipolar currency order, new stabilization mechanisms, and coordinated frameworks echo the same hopeful language that filled the 1930s, the belief that stability can be negotiated. But it can't. Stability must be earned through production, discipline, and real trust. History repeats, not because people forget, but because power remembers. Every empire learns from the last. The British Empire turned trade into finance. The American Empire turned finance into policy. The next may turn policy into data, programmable, traceable, and centrally synchronized. And it will promise, as always, cooperation. But remember what the Tripartite Agreement proved. Cooperation is never neutral. It's always control in disguise. If this connected 1936 to your world in 2025, share it. Because the patterns haven't changed, only the instruments have. Every monetary system begins as a promise and ends as a story. The Tripartite Agreement of 1936 was no exception. It promised stability and delivered dependency. It promised cooperation and created hierarchy. What began as a truce between equals became the prototype for every monetary illusion that followed. Think about it. Gold once bound governments to something tangible, something outside their will. When the metal anchor was replaced by paper, the power to create money became the power to define reality itself. From that moment on, economics ceased to be a science of value and became a theater of belief. The stage changed, London, Washington, Basel, but the plot never did. A small circle decides what the rest of the world must call price, inflation, and growth. We still live under the descendants of that pact. Today, when central bankers meet behind closed doors and coordinate policy, they are reenacting the same ritual, the worship of stability through manipulation. The numbers are digital now, the words more sophisticated, but the essence is the same. Create calm, harvest trust, and let time hide the imbalance. But time always collects its debt. Arithmetic waits patiently. Every era's illusion, whether gold convertibility, dollar hegemony, or quantitative easing, eventually collides with the limits of reality. Too much debt, too little production, too much faith in words. And when that collision comes, those who built the illusion say the same thing. No one could have seen it coming. Yet history saw it coming every time. The moral is simple but hard to accept. Systems don't collapse because of bad intentions. They collapse because belief outruns substance. When numbers outgrow gold, when credit outgrows income, when politics pretends to outvote mathematics, collapse isn't a risk, it's a schedule. So the Tripartite Agreement isn't just a forgotten chapter in economic history. It's a mirror, showing how power always seeks to manage truth rather than obey it. And every time we trade real value for managed stability, we step closer to another illusion. If you're hearing this in 2025, know this: the next Tripartite Agreement is already being drafted in data, in algorithms, in central bank code. The names will change, the promises will glow brighter, but the arithmetic will remain the same. If this opened your eyes to how history repeats through money, write truth over stability in the comments, because one day it won't be history. It'll be now.